Throughout the Second World War, there were many evil men who rose to incredibly powerful positions, and they were dragged out in front of a crowd for their executions after the war had been lost for them. The Soviets, even whilst the war was raging on, hanged many German war criminals on the gallows to show people inside of former occupied lands that justice was being carried out. Many of these executions were public to show those around that punishment was being carried out upon the Nazis. Some were even shot in front of huge crowds of thousands of people. In Poland, there were some former guards of a local concentration camp who were hanged upon a huge gallows structure, and 20,000 people looked on as the men and women swung from the huge wooden crossbeam. In this documentary compilation, we look at those top-ranking Nazis or collaborators who were subjected to a public execution in front of people at the end of World War II, but we won't be looking at those who were condemned behind prison walls. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Kurt Daluege was born on the 15th of September 1897 in Kreuzberg, a town in Upper Silesia. Little is known about his early life. However, he began to serve inside of the Prussian army in 1916, and he saw service in the First World War. He first saw action on the Eastern Front before being fast-tracked to becoming an officer, and after his officer training, he was transferred across to the Western Front. During action here, he was badly injured in the head and shoulder, and during a stay in hospital, it was stated how he was 25% disabled, showing how he was suffering from his wounds. Following the war, he was decorated for bravery, but he also then began to work as an engineer, and he became rather political and joined a number of organisations. Daluege joined the Upper Silesian Self-Defence and became their leader. This was a group of veterans from the First World War who began to come into conflict with Polish people in the Upper Silesian region. While studying engineering in Berlin, he also became a member of the Freikorps, who were a group of veterans who were unhappy with the Weimar Republic, and the paramilitary group, who were often armed, served as a threat for the post-war German government. It was at this time that Adolf Hitler was conducting many speeches for the Nazi Party, and he became the leader in 1921. The Nazis' influence initially was small over Munich, but word of mouth would spread the party's support, and in 1923 Daluege joined the Nazi Party. Following the failed Munich Putsch of 1923, when Hitler tried to take control of Munich and get declared the President of Germany, the leader was thrown into prison for a short time. But Daluege was not put off, despite efforts to suppress the party. He became involved in the Berlin Frontbahn, a restructured organisation of the SA that had been banned following the putsch. In 1926, following the lifting of the SA's ban, Daluege joined and he became the leader of the Berlin SA detachments and also became interlinked to the hierarchy of the Nazi Party. He also became the deputy for Joseph Goebbels, and with this he became rather popular. It's clear that Hitler must have valued him, as he was told to resign from the SA and to join the SS instead. This would prove to be a good decision, as 4 years later the SA would be purged during the Night of the Long Knives by the SS. Inside of the SS, Kurt Daluege's responsibilities were to spy on the SA, report of any signs of discontent between the stormtroopers in the Nazi hierarchy, and also to keep a close eye on the political opponents of the Nazis, such as communists. He was involved in keeping the SA under control, as in August 1930, a Berlin SA leader organised a group of the Brown Shirts to attack the Berlin party headquarters of the Nazis, and the SS led by Daluege defended it, and this was celebrated by Hitler. He recognised Daluege in an open letter stating, "SS man, your honour is loyalty, my honour is loyalty," which became the SS slogan. He was then promoted and took control of the SS in northern Germany, with Himmler overseeing the southern units of the SS. With this, it's interesting to look at a comparison between Himmler and Daluege. Himmler later would become the Reichsführer SS, and arguably the most powerful man in Germany behind Hitler, but Daluege's reputation is less known. He continued to achieve more power in Germany, becoming a member of the Reichstag, and also he became the overseer and boss of the General der Polizei, the non-political police. During the Night of the Long Knives, the purge of the SA, Daluege was incredibly ruthless against his former allies and friends, and he considered them a threat to society. He began to transition the police institute to become a rather Nazi police, and began to instill the ideologies onto them. His influence grew, and eventually his power over the uniform police went from Prussia to the whole of Germany, meaning all forms of the police force, from the railway police to the coast guard to even the broadcasting police, fell under his leadership. He restructured many of the departments, and later Himmler appointed him the chief of the Orpo, the Ordnungspolizei, which cemented his position as being in charge of almost all of the uniformed police under Nazi lands. By the outbreak of the Second World War, he had control of around 120,000 active police officers, and they were not just your normal police officers. They were brutal and were known for violently policing the state. As the Second World War carried on, he continued to take an active role in brutal actions. In 1941 he was present in a number of mass shootings of Jews in Poland and in Belarus, and also he was involved in the deportation of Jews. He signed orders for Jews to be taken from Germany, Austria, and Bohemia and Moravia and moved into ghettos. He was also present during a conference where Himmler debated the idea of expanding Operation Reinhardt, the secret Nazi operation to murder Polish Jews in Poland and other lands that fell under the control of the Nazis. He evidently supported these policies and did not stop any of them. But it was inside of the Czech Republic that Daluege really showed his brutality. Following the assassination of the Reich Protector for Bohemia and Moravia, the Butcher of Prague Reinhard Heinrich, brutal reprisals were ordered by Hitler on the area. Daluege succeeded as the Deputy Protector in 1942, and Hitler had been persuaded by Himmler to put Daluege into this position. A state of emergency had been declared after Heinrich's death, and scores of people were executed in reprisals, even when the assassins had not been found. It was decided that revenge would be had on the area, and it was reported from Hitler that he commanded a huge number of brutal reprisals for any village found to have harboured Heinrich's assassins. These orders were to execute all adult men, transport women to concentration camps, gather up suitable children for them to be placed in SS families, and to finally burn down the village and level it. Daluege, along with SS officers, ordered the villages of Lidice and Lazaki to be razed to the ground, with these policies being brutally carried out. Inside of the villages, when the Nazis rolled in, there was complete terror. Lidice was chosen as its residents were accused of hiding partisans, and inside of them all of the men were rounded up and taken to a farm on the edge of the village. Mattresses were taken from the houses and were stood up against the wall of a barn to prevent bullets ricocheting off. The shooting began at 7 a.m. on the 10th of June 1942, with men being shot in groups of 5. This was deemed to be too slow, and then the firing squads began to shoot men in groups of 10. Only 3 male villagers survived. 203 women and 105 children were taken and transported to a nearby grammar school. Children were then taken from their mothers, and then the mothers were later loaded on trucks to be taken to concentration camps. Many of the children who were not chosen for Germanisation were sent to Helmno concentration camp, where over 80 were gassed inside of gas vans. The village was then burnt to the ground and the buildings were destroyed with explosives. Pets and working animals were also slaughtered, and the Germans even dug up the remains of those interred in the town cemetery, and even looted some of the remains for gold teeth. Lazaki was destroyed 2 weeks later, when a radio transmitter belonging to the team who parachuted Heinrich's assassins were found. Daluege was ultimately brought into Czechoslovakia, as a previous man, Hans Frank, had not carried out sufficient brutal reprisals, but Daluege was seen as a worthy sadist to complete the job. He continued in his roles until May 1943, when he suffered a huge heart attack and almost died. In the months after, he was relieved of his jobs and offices, and was gifted a large property by Hitler. However, in May 1945, Daluege was arrested by British soldiers in Lubeck, in northern Germany. He was then taken to Luxembourg before he was extradited to Czechoslovakia to be tried for the crimes against the people who he served in his role as protector. He was placed on trial for his crimes against humanity, and throughout the trial he was ignorant and said 3 million police officers venerated him. He claimed he was only following the orders of Hitler and said he committed no crimes. He was sentenced to death, being convicted of all charges. The day after his guilty verdict, he was executed by hanging. Inside of the walls of Pankrak prison in Prague, which during the Nazi occupation was a Gestapo investigation centre, he was executed. He was led out of the prison into a courtyard, and outside where hundreds of spectators had gathered to witness Daluege's death. The crowd was made up of members of the public as well as guards, and when he was led out he was flanked by them. He was then led to the execution pole. He was not executed using a gallows or a trapdoor. This pole method was mostly used in Czechoslovakia, and it was where a rope was passed for a pulley at the bottom of the pole. Then the condemned was hoisted to the top of the pole by a sling running across their chests. A noose was then placed around Daluege's neck, and when the chest sling was released, he jerked downwards, and then his head was guided down by the executioner's own hand, and it dislocated the neck. Daluege suffered this fate, and there was a huge amount of people there to witness his death. His hanging and execution was performed efficiently, and within minutes of entering the prison yard, he was declared dead. Kurt Daluege was responsible for the massacres of hundreds during the Second World War, and the brutal reprisals following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. He is remembered as the chief of the uniformed order police that served the Nazi Party with ruthless efficiency and worked with other guards to instill fear into the people. He was guilty of a number of crimes, but what's clear is that he had little remorse for his crimes, going to his execution as staunch a Nazi as he was when he was serving Hitler.
Born on the 30th of May 1922, Jenny Wanda Barkmann was born in Hamburg, and she had a rather modest upbringing. She was raised by her father, who was a dock worker, and the family did not always have too much money, as her mother was a housewife. As a child, Jenny was a normal girl, and she dreamt of becoming an actress. Following her schooling, she tried to become a fashion model, and Jenny was noted for her good looks and appearance, but the outbreak of the Second World War did not change her plans, and she continued to be involved in photo shoots for German magazines and also in different advertising agencies. But then at some point at the start of 1944, something changed in the life of Jenny Wanda Barkmann. Suddenly she quit her modelling career, and then she appealed to an advertisement which was issued by the German SS, and they said they needed women to work inside of the concentration camps. Many women were recruited to work inside of the evil sites, and some went for money, and some wanted a complete change in their life. At the time, Jenny Wanda Barkmann was just around 21, and she probably wanted the money, and also the idea of career advancement, or she may have been obsessed with the idea of wielding power over others. She was interviewed for the job, and she passed this interview, and then she trained to become an overseer or an Aufseherin inside of a concentration camp. She was then transferred to the Stutthof concentration camp, which was known for being a very brutal site. At Stutthof in Gdansk, there were 110,000 inmates who were held within the barbed wire fences, and 65,000 people would never make it out alive. The camp was staffed by SS guards and also Ukrainian auxiliaries, and the first female guards at Stutthof were brought in during 1942, and a total of 295 women would work there. Stutthof had a huge number of prisoners come from different countries, and the conditions there were very harsh. Thousands of prisoners died from starvation and disease, and lots died from typhus epidemics that swept through the camp in winter 1942 and also 1944, and many inmates were too sick to work, and they were then sent to the camp's small gas chamber. Executions were carried out on a daily basis, with prisoners being shot on the firing range and also being sent to the gas chambers. Others were executed on gallows during roll call to strike fear into the hearts of the inmates. Others were injected with phenol, and the prisoners sometimes were beaten to death by the guards, and some even drowned in the mud. Many prisoners were rented out by other companies for slave labour, and Stutthof became infamous for its evil. Jenny Barkmann, as soon as she arrived, showed her evil and brutal side, and she had a talent for cruelty and sadism. She was known for beating inmates almost to death and then sending them to the gas chambers. She would torture prisoners in different ways, and some of these actions even shocked the other guards. People believed that she was fragile and intelligent when she was still a very young woman, but she then became known as Mad Jenny and also the Beautiful Spectre. It's believed that she had dozens of victims, and she would also take part in selections where they were taken to the gas chambers on a daily basis. It's believed she was responsible for the deaths of many, and she killed with her own hands through violent beatings. She also sent many children as well as women to their deaths, but as the Second World War was coming to an end, Mad Jenny sought to try and escape justice. As the Soviet Red Army were on the horizon, she ran off, and Jenny Barkmann became one of the most hunted war criminals before the war had come to an end. She managed to evade capture for a while, before in May 1945 she was arrested as she was boarding a train in Gdansk to leave. She had been helped while she was hiding for some time, but the image of Jenny Barkmann had been kept in the records of the camp, and prisoners remembered her well, and the description of Jenny was sent all over Europe to try and find her. But following her interrogation, she said she had always treated the prisoners of Stutthof well, and that she had never killed or ill-treated the inmates. She also said that she helped some who were suffering and were starving, and also that some had been saved from death by her. But the descriptions of her antics and what she was saying did not add up, and one prison guard was even fooled by her lies. This man began to sympathise with her, and she begged this guard to let her out of her prison cell for a few hours. But when the guard saw the inmates and her victims, he did not let her out ever again. Jenny Wanda Barkmann was brought to the Stutthof trials, and at trial dozens of prisoners from the camp testified against her. Documents were also brought forward showing and portraying her evil, and her lawyer tried to make a case that she was insane and was not fit enough to stand trial. He claimed that she did not have the capacity to make sound decisions and that she was insane. However, she did not come across crazy at all. Jenny spent most of her time at the trial flirting with guards and bothering more about her hair than the evils that she had committed whilst at the camp when she worked there. She would laugh in the face of witnesses, but for her crimes she was sentenced to death. When this was announced, she did not cry, and she listened to it calmly. However, the final words of her court case were, "Life is really a great pleasure, and pleasure, as a rule, does not last long." On the 4th of July 1946, early in the morning, Jenny Wanda Barkmann, along with the 10 other convicted war criminals, were taken to a site of execution on the Biskupia Gorka Hill near Gdansk. On these hills were huge gallows which had been constructed to execute the former guards of Stutthof. Over 200,000 people were there to witness the proceedings, and Jenny was then brought out in front of the crowd, and she was helped onto the back of a truck. The executioners were stood with her, they then sat her down on a stool whilst the adjustments to the noose were made. Then Jenny Barkmann was told to stand on the stool, then the noose was fastened around her neck. Shortly after this, the truck drove off, and Jenny Wanda Barkmann was left on the gallows, and within minutes, the horrific war criminal, with thousands looking on, was declared dead. Jenny Wanda Barkmann was just 24 when she was executed on the gallows for her crimes at Stutthof concentration camp. She would have dreamed of a career modelling or being an actress. However, the lure of a brutal life wielding power and violence over people was too much for her to resist. Inside of Stutthof, she became known for her evil antics and actions, and she was also known for her cruelty, in which she ordered many executions and carried killing out with her bare hands. She was a woman who became notorious alongside other guards of the Holocaust, such as Irma Grazer, Johanna Bormann, and Elizabeth Volkenrath, for their terrible actions and sadism. But what drove her to enter a world dominated by the evil of the SS? Still today her motives are not entirely known.
Karl Hermann Frank was born in January 1898 in Austria-Hungary, and he was taught by his father with regard to politics. His father was a proud nationalist who was angry with regards to the government, but as the First World War broke out, Frank tried to join the Austro-Hungarian army, but he was turned down because he suffered with blindness in his right eye. Because of this, he looked for a different career, and he spent a year at a law school in Prague, but he then became exposed to nationalistic policies in Germany and the ideas of the National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. Karl Hermann Frank then joined the Nazis, and he was involved in establishing different regional bases for the party in certain areas. He opened a bookshop in 1925, and this specialised in Nazi publications and books, and Frank also became a power behind the Sudeten German Homeland Front. He would become the deputy leader of this, and he was then elected as a member of the Czechoslovak parliament. But he was a Nazi still, and he was then, when the Germans were given the Sudetenland following the Munich conference, made the deputy Gauleiter, or deputy regional leader, in this part of the Reich. He then officially joined the Nazi Party, and also the SS, on the 1st of November 1938. In 1939, Frank was promoted to become an SS Gruppenführer, and he was then made the Secretary of State for the Reich Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, as the Nazis seized control of the whole of Czechoslovakia. He was serving under Konstantin von Neurath, and was named the area's higher SS and police leader, meaning he was in charge of the SS and the Nazi police in this region. This meant that he controlled also the Gestapo, the SD and the Kripo, and their actions, and he was very powerful. He had a huge amount of influence in the region and control, and he would also try to suppress elements of the resistance and those who dissented against the Nazi occupation. He targeted the Prime Minister, and he was much more hard-line than Neurath, who was considered soft. Karl Hermann Frank wanted roundups, torture and execution for those who would not fall into line, and Frank would usurp Neurath and would go to Hitler, and Hitler would back Frank and would adopt a stronger approach in the region. Neurath was later sacked, and Frank wanted to be appointed as a deputy protector of Bohemia and Moravia behind Reinhard Heydrich, and Reinhard Heydrich was given the power to do whatever he wanted in the area. Heydrich would carry out public executions, and also would slaughter many civilians to bring the rest into line, as he needed to keep the region productive and to keep up their quotas for the German war effort. Frank and Heydrich would work together in this, and their relationship was a notoriously good one, but this meant more suffering for the civilian population. They would terrorise the population and killed opponents, and also deported thousands of Jews to concentration and extermination camps. Thousands were arrested, and hundreds were being executed. But Heydrich would be assassinated in 1942, and it's possible that there were plans drawn up to assassinate Frank too. But following Heydrich's death, Frank was passed over for promotion, and Kurt Daluege replaced Heydrich, and the pair would organise the razing of Czech villages, including Ledis and Lazaki, as punishment for Heydrich's death. Frank ordered an SD chief to shoot all the men and to send all women to concentration camps, and to then rip children away from their homes, and to send them to Germany for Germanisation if they were deemed worthy of it. Other children were just murdered. Further promotions came, and Frank was then appointed as a General of Police in Prague, and he was also a Waffen SS General. He continued to become a feared beast, and he was the most powerful man in Bohemia and Moravia, and one of the most experienced in leadership, and he was then made the Minister of State, and was then able to attend cabinet meetings with Hitler with regards to the activities in the region. He would order further anti-partisan raids, and thousands of soldiers were then deployed in keeping the underground resistance down. They would carry out many executions, but the Germans could not destroy the partisan orders altogether, as they were too strong and they knew the areas too well. As the Nazis' empire crumbled around them, Prague stayed in control of the Nazis. It was the last major city amongst the major European ones to be freed. Karl Hermann Frank was defiant in his stance to defend the city from attackers, and on the 30th of April 1945 he made a broadcast over the radio. He said that if an uprising should occur, then he would drown anyone involved in a sea of blood, before ordering the streets to be cleared of anyone, and that the army and police should shoot anyone, including civilians, on sight. With this, the streets of Prague became a bloodbath, with many being simply executed for just leaving their homes. But at the end of the Second World War, Karl Hermann Frank was arrested by American soldiers on the 9th of May 1945. He was interrogated and processed before he would then, in 1946, be sent to Prague to stand trial for the crimes that he committed in this area. He had tried to flee, as he knew he was a wanted war criminal, and he was then represented by a Czech lawyer at his trial, which he considered a complete disgrace. He was accused of many crimes, including war crimes, and the horrific massacres he ordered after Heydrich's death, and for all of these crimes he was then sentenced to death. On the 22nd of May 1946, inside of a courtyard outside of Prague's Pankrat prison, there were thousands gathered to witness the execution of the beast, who had caused so much suffering inside of Czechoslovakia. Thousands were on the streets to witness the execution of Karl, Hermann, Frank, and it was said that those of Ladice's widows who were able to come, and the widows of some of the 30,000 other Czechs for whose executions Frank had been adjudged indirectly responsible, occurred the second row of seats. But there was no compassion for Karl Hermann Frank. He was dragged out to the execution post, and he wore a ragged Nazi elite guard uniform and was paraded out between two guards. He was then led onto the scaffold, and the executioner then secured his legs and chest and passed a rope around the pulley and the noose around the top of the stake. The noose was secured around his neck then, and Frank then said, "Germany will live, even if we do not live." Following this, the ropes were released and he was left hanging. It was said that the spectators watched quietly in the bright sun as Frank was executed. His body was then buried in an unmarked grave, and the hangman kept the rope used to hang him as a souvenir, but he would then lose this following a night of heavy drinking. But Karl Hermann Frank was a horrific SS man who for decades was an ardent Nazi. He was an SS man who believed the Nazis would reign supreme over Europe, and his actions in the Czech region would lead to thousands being killed and slaughtered. He was a man who showed little remorse for his crimes, and went to his execution for this.
Heinrich Jockel was born on the 10th of July 1898 in Offenbach am Main. It's assumed that he had a normal upbringing and schooling, and after he left school in 1913, he worked as a farm labourer. He was mobilised for service within the German army during World War I, and then as the conflict came to an end, he returned to work in the fields. After the First World War, like so many who turned to extreme politics to deal with the problems that Germany faced, Jockel joined the Nazi Party. Hyperinflation and other issues caused the Weimar Republic to crumble, and people turned to Hitler's Nazi Party. Jockel joined the party in 1931 and was member number 763,122. He later joined the SS in 1933 after Hitler seized power and control. His role inside the SS is disputed, but he must have been highly rated, as he had risen to the position of an Untersturmführer in November 1935. He was then promoted again to an Obersturmführer, and then he became a Hauptsturmführer in November 1938. It's believed that he was involved in the concentration camp system and gained some degree of experience from this. As the Second World War broke out, he was kept away from the front lines in terms of combat fighting, and within the SS he was involved in establishing labour camps. The Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia began with the annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938, and then continued a year later with the invasion of Czech lands and the establishment of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which incorporated all parts of former Czechoslovakia. The Nazis set up huge scores of camps and detainment centres across the occupied lands, and in February 1939, Jockel was sent to the Sudetenland as a commander of an Orpo detachment. Under his control, they set up 2 different labour camps, and it's assumed that this was successful as he gained more high-profile work. In autumn 1939, Jockel had been established as a camp commandant of a concentration camp. This was part of a number of different camps inside of the Sudetenland, but it belonged to a larger network including camps inside of Poland and Silesia. The specific camp that Jockel oversaw was found in a former sugar refinery and was seen as a labour reformatory by the Germans. These camps were built for slave labour, and they had permanent German staff, as well as forced workers who had been captured as the Germans took more territory. Jockel must have been noticed by his SS superiors, as after his job as the commandant of this small camp, he was transferred to work in a Gestapo prison, the small fortress of Theresienstadt, in June 1940. This camp was operated by the Gestapo, and Jockel had already worked for them in some capacity. The small fortress operated long before it became a Nazi work camp, known as Terezin, and even the assassin Gavrilo Princip, who shot Franz Ferdinand, the gunshot that started World War I, was imprisoned and died here from TB. In the early days of the camp's establishment, mostly Czech prisoners were kept here. The Nazis needed to use the small fortress as existing prisons became full, as they were arresting many members of resistance groups and also communists. Those who helped the resistance and people who committed sabotage, along with Jews who broke anti-Semitic laws, were imprisoned there. Following the assassination of Reich Protector Reinhard Heydrich, who oversaw the Protectorate, the Nazis imprisoned huge scores of people at the small fortress. It was divided into a number of areas and courtyards. The first courtyard was for men, and roll call took place every morning and evening, and prisoners were split by nationality, and up to 90 people were kept in the cells of a barrack building. They had to sleep on wooden planks, 3 stories high, and then there was only one sink and toilet, and water had to be reused. Prisoners were banned from using light, and there was no heating, and lice often was common. Such was the bad hygiene. The second courtyard was for administration and the transports that arrived there. Often it took hours to admit prisoners, and here inmates gave over their belongings. Prisoners were given old Czech army uniforms, and women were allowed to keep their civilian clothes. If the inmate was Jewish, they were forced to wear a yellow star, and all the men were shaved bald. Jews were kept in nearby ghettos also, but those who escaped and involved themselves in the resistance were sent to the small fortress for punishment. They were tortured and often murdered within the walls. The Jewish cells were incredibly cramped and had no toilets or fresh air. Another courtyard was built in 1943, and here prisoners were forced to watch the executions that took place there. The barracks here held up to 600 people, who slept on the floor or in beds. There were 2 toilets per 600 people, and disease was rampant. There were no showers in 1945, and typhus broke out, killing dozens. There were also 20 solitary confinement cells at the camp, overseen by Jockel, and a tiny and small infirmary was set up, but this was not good enough. Jewish and Russian prisoners were not allowed to receive any medical treatment, and this instruction came straight from Heinrich Jockel, the camp's commandant. He regularly denied people the treatment they should have been given. One of the most sinister parts of the camp was the gate of death that opened up onto the execution courtyard, a former shooting range. Executions were common at Terezin, but only a few prisoners were hanged, and most were shot. It's believed that up to 300 were executed there. Then after they were killed, their bodies were thrown in a mass grave. At the camp, Jockel, who was in charge, as mentioned, denied medical help to Jewish prisoners, and also assigned them the most difficult work. Many often died because of their overworking, and it was known that Jockel lived in the camp with his own family. As the Second World War turned against the Nazis and the Germans, in May 1945, with the Red Army approaching, Jockel gave one final deadly order, where he sentenced 53 prisoners to death, and these were shot, but within a few days he had left Theresienstadt with his family. His timing was 3 days before the Red Army seized the camp and liberated the small fortress. For a while he went on the run, and he ordered his family to leave him and head back to Germany without him. Jockel found sanctuary briefly in Offenbach. However, within weeks of going on the run, the Americans had located him, and he was arrested by counterintelligence services, who then interrogated him. Jockel was then handed over to the Czechs and was extradited on January 26, 1946. He was further interrogated, and in an act of justice was imprisoned inside the very camp that he oversaw with great brutality. He was kept inside the cells for the Jews that were noted during the camp's opening to have been very cramped and awful. Whilst here he was imprisoned alongside his wife and eldest daughter, who were also caught and taken there. Eventually Heinrich Jockel was placed on trial, and inside of a Czech courtroom, Litoměřice, he was sentenced to death. The court heard of all the tales of the camp and heard from many witnesses who told of the mistreatment there, and also told of how Jockel had ordered and proceeded over executions that took place. For his crimes, he was ordered to pay for them with his life. Close to the camp he oversaw, he was brought onto a small gallows for his execution. The Czechs did not use the long drop method or a specifically sophisticated method to carry out hangings, but more insisted on using something such as a pole method. Heinrich Jockel, on October 26, 1946, was brought out into a courtyard where the stake for his execution and the executioner was ready for him. To witness the proceedings, a large amount of people were there, including members of the military, and also those who had been imprisoned inside of the camp. He was brought into the courtyard, then was led up a number of steps onto a wooden platform. Whilst here, he was secured around his waist to the wooden post with a belt, and his legs were then tied together with a rope.
A hook was found on the post above his head, and he was suspended off the ground. Eventually, once everything was prepared, the noose was placed around his neck, and the rope jerked, suspending him in the air, snapping his neck. His execution was rather swift, and for those who witnessed the proceedings, it was a tiny piece of justice for the crimes exerted by the Nazis during the Second World War on the Czech people. Heinrich Jockel had overseen the fortress camp with such brutality. Although there wasn't a gas chamber installed there, unlike many other concentration camps, it was known for its incredibly tough conditions and also its executions. Jockel, like so many, oversaw a huge number of deaths inside concentration camps and contributed to the horrific crimes of the Second World War that the Nazis committed. Ion Antonescu was born into a bourgeois family which had some military background. He was born in 1882 and was a student at a number of military schools within Romania. He was a keen student and graduated in cavalry school as top of his class, and he did not shy away from conflict, as he made a name for himself during the 1907 Peasants' Revolt, in which he was in charge of a cavalry unit, and it was said that he was very violent in quashing the revolt with his unit. He managed to subdue the revolt in one city, and was praised by the king and prince for his effort. Antonescu was promoted a number of times, but when Romania entered the First World War in 1916, he was a chief of staff for General Constantin Prețan. In this, he played a key role in Romania's successful defence against German soldiers, but after the war he was also part of a military attaché in Paris and London. He continued to rise throughout different positions and gained more authority upon his return to Romania, before becoming the defence minister in 1937. He then, in September 1940, rose to the position of Prime Minister. The king's popularity at the time was a record low, and Antonescu was appointed to help sort out the crisis. But within 2 days of being in the position of Prime Minister, the king transferred most of his dictatorial powers to Antonescu, and with this he became the dictator of Romania. He had forced the king off his throne, but his son did succeed him, but Michael was a puppet for Antonescu's regime. At the time in Europe, war was very much underway, but Romania found themselves surrounded by two huge foreign powers, and Antonescu then had to make the decision as to form an alliance with one of them to protect Romania and the interests of his country. He chose to side with Nazi Germany, and he hoped that by joining an alliance with them, that Romania would be protected. At the time, the Germans were aggressively expanding into new lands and were occupying large swathes of Europe. He hoped that Romania could be of use for Hitler in Nazi Germany, and Hitler saw the country as a valuable resource due to the oil inside of the nation, and he thought this would be useful for the German war effort. He built an alliance with the revolutionary fascist party of the Iron Guard, and these were strongly anti-communist and anti-Semitic groups within Romania. Antonescu, when he came into power, brought the Iron Guard with him, but he later was forced to destroy the movement after the Legionnaires' rebellion. Their leader argued constantly with Antonescu, and Sima thought that the economic policy of Romania should be worked out with Germany, but Antonescu saw him as a threat. He gained Hitler's support and the support of the army to launch a 3-day civil war against the Iron Guard, and he won decisively, with the Romanian and German army backing him. At one point during the crisis, the Iron Guard were heavily involved in instigating deadly and savage attacks on the Jews, with many being executed publicly and mutilated. The Iron Guard party was smashed, but more bloodshed came. In June 1940, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, and Antonescu sent his troops with them as well. Romanian units served with German units, and initially it was thought by the Germans that the Roman army was poorly equipped and had insufficient armour and training. Antonescu ordered, without the Germans, for the Romanian army to maintain a 2-month siege of Odessa, and the Fourth Army suffered heavy losses of around 100,000 men. In Odessa there were large-scale massacres of the Jewish population, and this was allegedly ordered by Antonescu in reprisal. He was in regular meetings with Hitler and his German military commanders, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel described him as a capable soldier dedicated to his mission in life, open-hearted and forthright, but uncommunicative and often blunt. With the Germans, the Romanians fought deep into the Soviet Union, and following the Battle of Moscow, they were asked to provide more soldiers for the German war effort.
Antonescu was briefed on the planned Battle of the Caucasus, and for committing his soldiers, Antonescu was given a car from Hitler. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Romania also declared war on America, but everything changed following the Battle of Stalingrad. During the horrific fighting around the city, Romania lost around 150,000 men, and more than half of their divisions were wiped out. They continued to lose many soldiers throughout the following months as the Soviets advanced, retaking their lands from the German and Axis invaders. His time as dictator of Romania saw him oversee a number of massacres of Jews, in which his soldiers slaughtered thousands. In the final weeks of December 1941, for example, his soldiers killed around 70,000 Jews at the Bogdanovka camp, and Antonescu justified it as a necessary evil to stop typhus spreading because of the poor conditions. As mentioned, the Odessa massacre was an act of punishment carried out by the Romanian army, and it's estimated that over 50,000 Jews were killed there. It's been claimed to have been the largest single massacre of Jews in the Second World War, and they were shot, hanged, and some were even burned alive. Antonescu claimed the events were merely reprisals and not war crimes, and dozens of thousands more people were forced out of the Odessa area. Antonescu stated, "Pack them in the catacombs, throw them in the Black Sea, but get them out of Odessa. I don't want to know, 100 can die, 1,000 can die, all of them can die, but I don't want a single Romanian officer to die." Following the loss of Stalingrad, Antonescu's popularity dwindled, and in April 1944, the Russian soldiers ordered the Romanians to surrender. He refused to do so, remaining stern in his support for Hitler, and in spring 1944, large-scale Allied bombing raids took place in Bucharest. The battle for Romania began in the summer. However, as the Romanians were losing heavily, the opportunity to overthrow Antonescu came, and the royal coup of the 23rd of August occurred, in which he was removed from power, and King Michael I of Romania, who led the coup, placed Antonescu under arrest, and then switched sides, joining the Allies and abandoning the Axis cause, and also declaring war on Germany. Ion Antonescu was placed in the custody of PCR militants, and he was held in a number of different places. He was later handed over to the Soviets, who transferred him to Moscow, and was then given rather luxurious mansions in the city, but was kept under house arrest. He was guarded heavily by secret forces, but after the end of the Second World War in Europe, he was moved to Lubyanka prison. Here he was interrogated by the secret services, and he was seen as a key perpetrator of the Holocaust, as his Romanian soldiers were known for performing genocide and organising mass shootings. Whilst he was held in prison, he tried to take his own life, but he then was returned to Romania and Bucharest. He was imprisoned in the Jilaka prison and was interrogated, but during this he complained about his treatment back home. He complained about the conditions in prison and that he was a vegetarian and he had not been given a special diet. In May 1946, Antonescu was prosecuted and charged with crimes against peace, treason and war crimes. He was represented by 2 public defenders, and they failed to establish his defence that he had no say in the war and in fact was overruled by Germany, and that he was forced to pick a side between the Soviets and Nazi Germany. Much of the evidence at its trial was uncovered about the massacres oversaw in his time, looking after the war effort. Ion Antonescu was found guilty of the charges put before him, and he tried to appeal twice, but they were both rejected, and he was subsequently sentenced to death. He even tried to appeal to the king for clemency, but nothing happened with regards to this. On the 1st of June 1946, he was led out of his prison to an execution site near to the Jilava prison. A firing squad had been gathered to execute the former Prime Minister of Romania, and Antonescu was led out to face them. In a clearing, he was accompanied to his execution by 4 other men who were dying that day, and Antonescu was the most high profile to be executed. He was tied to a stake to ensure that he could not move, and images show him stood rather nonchalantly, with his arms crossed and his palms clasped in his final moments. The charges and confirmation of death was read, and then shortly after the firing squad were readied. They were told to aim, and then quickly they fired upon the men, including Antonescu, who was killed instantly. He refused to wear a blindfold facing his executioners, and he raised his hat in a salute once the order to fire was given. At the end of the firing squad, Ion Antonescu had his final moments. He was seen as a warmonger who had overseen barbaric massacres in the course of the Second World War. By choosing to side with Hitler, he nailed his flag to a post and was willing to send his country into the Axis alliance alongside Hitler. He is regarded as a key perpetrator of the Holocaust, and through his policies he was responsible for the deaths of around 400,000 people, including Bessarabian, Romanian and Ukrainian Jews, as well as the Romani. His execution for many was seen as a necessary thing for Romania to move on following World War II. Ferenc Szalasi was born in January 1897, and he believed that he was given power to rule from God through his mother's milk. He lived with his mother right until 1944, and he followed his father's footsteps and joined the army as a young man. He finished his studies and then went to a military academy. He finished this and then was promoted to the rank of lieutenant in 1915, and he became an officer serving in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War. He was on the front lines for 3 years and was based on the Italian front before he was sent to Verdun in the final days of the conflict. Following the political struggles in Hungary after the war, Szalasi was apolitical, and he was not involved in political events post-war in Hungary. He continued to train inside of the military, and he enrolled in the General Staff Officers Training at other military academies. He was seen as an outstanding officer, and it's considered that he was popular and a beloved member of the military. His fellow officers saw him as very intelligent and a very skilled commander, but others believed he was too powerful. He continued to succeed in the military and achieved the rank of a major. When Gyula Gumbos became the Prime Minister of Hungary around 1932, Szalasi became more involved in politics, and he then became obsessed with it. He was considered a fanatical right-wing nationalist who believed that Hungary should expand its borders back to former levels. It had previously had its lands reduced by around 72%, and he then wrote a pamphlet and sent it to other politicians, but because he was a soldier, he was banned from being involved in politics, and was sentenced to 20 days imprisonment, and was then expelled from the General Staff. Following his release, he then served as a staff officer, but then was disillusioned with the army, and he decided to give his time to politics. He first made the Party of National Will a nationalistic party, and this was later banned for being too radical. But then Szalasi set up the Hungarian National Socialist Party in 1937, but this was also banned, but he did gather support from lower classes and workers. This party was anti-Semitic, but following the German Anschluss of Austria, Szalasi's followers became more radical, and he himself was arrested and imprisoned. But he was then proclaimed the National Socialist Arrow Party leader, which was a coalition of several right-wing groups, and this attracted a large number of people to it. It gained 30 seats in power, and then became eventually one of the biggest parties in Hungary. But when the Second World War broke out, the Arrow Cross Party was banned, and Szalasi was forced to work underground, and he did gain the backing of the Germans. But in March 1944, the Nazis occupied Hungary. Hitler launched Operation Marguerite, and in this, his soldiers were told to occupy the country, and with this he instilled the pro-German Derm Sotsche as the Prime Minister of Hungary. But the key thing for Szalasi was that the Arrow Cross Party was then legalised, and he was then able to attract more members to the party. But when the Prime Minister was quickly deposed, Szalasi then became an enemy of the Hungarian government, and the regent ordered his arrest. But the Germans in Szalasi had a perfect ally, and the Hungarian regent began to plan to come to peace with the Soviets and end Hungary's involvement in the Axis alliance. But the Germans then kidnapped his son and threatened to kill him unless the regent abdicated and put Ferenc Szalasi in power. A document was signed naming Szalasi as the Prime Minister, and this made the Arrow Cross Party partially in power. He was then placed as the head of the state, and then his government changed the Kingdom of Hungary into a puppet state of Nazi Germany. The Council of Regency was established and approved, and on the 4th of November 1944, Szalasi was made the leader of the nation, and he was joined in power by 16 ministers, half who belonged to his Arrow Cross Party. But whilst in power, he had very few other plans but to carry out the policies which pleased the Nazis. He executed the Nazi Party's beliefs and ideology, and he did this to please Hitler and to stop the Germans being a threat. Along with the Nazis, Szalasi's government recommended the deportation of the Jews which had been paused.
His government promoted martial law, and they carried out large-scale executions of those who were considered possible enemies of Szalasi and his party. He also deported thousands of Jews, and many were executed and killed inside of the gas chambers, and despite not being in power for long, in particular 163 days, he had a devastating and deadly effect. He also sent large amounts of Hungarian produce and resources to Germany to help with their war effort, and he forced young and old men into the last remnants of the Hungarian army, being forced to fight the Soviet war machine of the Red Army. When he took control of the country, the Red Army were inside of Hungary, and his authority was rather limited, but his party did deport 80,000 people to the concentration camps. But on the 19th of November 1944, he had nowhere to go, as he was inside Budapest as it was encircled by the Soviet Red Army, and also the Romanian army, as they surrounded the city. This resulted in a 102-day siege of Budapest, but as it took hold, he managed to escape and flee. He fled to a city in the west of Hungary, then carried on to Vienna in March 1945, and then he went to Munich. But as Hungary capitulated and fell to the Soviets, the cabinet of the Arrow Cross Party had fled the lands, and it was dissolved on the 7th of May 1945, the day before Germany surrendered. But on the 6th of May, the day before, Ferenc Szalasi was captured by the Americans, and months later was repatriated back to Hungary. The Hungarians then tried him by the People's Tribunal in Budapest, and many open sessions took place, where war criminals were sentenced to death and were executed for high treason. Ferenc Szalasi was placed on trial for high treason, but also war crimes, and he was deemed guilty of deporting thousands of his own people to their deaths in concentration camps. He was virtually hated by the Hungarian people, and on the 12th of March 1946, he was brought to Budapest in a town square, where he was to be executed. Along with two of his former ministers and a party theologist, the group of the Arrow Cross members were then led to where a number of large posts had been placed. The method of execution for Ferenc Szalasi was hanging using the Austrian pole method, and a few large posts had been set up, with a rope attached to a hook at the top. Szalasi was taken up to the scaffold, and he was then flanked by guards, and members of the public watched on. He was placed with his back to the post, and his arms and legs were tied up, so he could not move. Then the noose was placed around his neck, and the rope was then tightened, before the executioner took the steps from underneath him. He had been given the last rites before, but the post only left a couple of feet between the hanging man and the ground, and this method of execution in particular led to him slowly strangling to death, rather than having his neck snapped. He struggled and strangled, but then he succumbed to his death shortly after, whilst the public looked on. He was then buried in a new public cemetery in Budapest, but Ferenc Szalasi was considered a serious war criminal inside of Hungary, despite only being in office and power from the 16th of October 1944 to the 28th of March 1945. Despite initially being a military officer, he entered politics and crafted his right-wing ideas. But Szalasi became a man whose party were involved in collaborating with the Nazis in their politics and beliefs, which resulted in the mass murder and brutality of people and their deaths inside of the concentration camps. But he was executed in front of a huge crowd in Budapest.